The smell hits you first. It is not the familiar, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol, floor bleach, and sharp ozone that defines a modern emergency room. It is an oppressive, physical weight of open sewers, rotting animal carcasses, and unwashed bodies, baked under a pale, merciless autumn sun. When James opened his eyes, the smooth linoleum floors of St. Jude's Medical Center were gone. Instead, his hands sank into thick, cold mud mixed with animal dung. He scrambled backward, his modern blue scrubs quickly soaking through with liquid filth. Looking up, he did not see the fluorescent lights of his hospital ward. He saw leaning timber-framed houses, their upper stories blotting out the dim sky, leaning so close together across the narrow alleyway that they seemed to whisper secrets of decay. He thought it was a hallucination brought on by a grueling 36-hour shift. Perhaps he had collapsed from profound exhaustion in the doctor's break room. But the freezing mud scraping against his palms was too real. The biting chill of the wind was too sharp. He stood up, trembling, his eyes darting across the chaotic, primitive alley. A few feet away, a mangy pig rooted through a pile of human waste. And then, his eyes locked onto a shape slumped against a rotting wooden doorframe. His reflexes as a chief resident took over. He knelt beside the figure, reaching out to check for a carotid pulse. The skin was cold, stiff, and covered in a thick layer of soot and grime. But it was what lay beneath the grime that made James freeze, his medical training screaming in disbelief. Huge, bulbous swellings the size of apples protruded from the dead man's neck and groin. They were dark purple, almost black, oozing a foul, yellowish fluid from tiny, agonizing ruptures. The tips of the man's fingers were completely black, shriveled and dead like pieces of charcoal. James staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. He knew those clinical symptoms instantly. Every medical student memorized them, but only as a historical curiosity, a distant horror from an introductory chapter on medieval epidemiology. Buboes. Acral necrosis. The Black Death. He was not in his hospital. He was standing in the absolute heart of the year 1348, at the dawn of the deadliest pandemic in human history. The realization brought a wave of cold panic that nearly brought him to his knees. He had no smartphone, no identification, no antibiotics, and no way home. He was wearing nothing but flimsy cotton scrubs and running shoes. As he stumbled out of the alleyway onto a wider dirt street, the full scale of the nightmare unfolded before him. The city was in a state of absolute, apocalyptic collapse. The air was thick with the black, greasy smoke of burning tar and pitch, lit by locals who believed the foul vapors would cleanse the miasma of disease. People hurried past him, their faces masked with cloths soaked in vinegar. They gave James wide berths, staring in terror at his strange blue garments. The sound of weeping echoed from shuttered windows, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic clattering of wooden cart wheels over cobblestones. James watched in horror as a man pulling a cart piled high with naked, twisted corpses stopped outside a house. The driver did not knock, he merely called out for the dead to be brought down, his voice hollow and deadened by the sheer repetition of tragedy. James felt a deep, instinctive urge to run, to isolate himself in the woods, to escape the invisible cloud of Yersinia pestis bacteria that he knew was swirling through the air. But as he turned another corner, a frantic voice shattered his panic. A man in a heavy leather apron grabbed James by the shoulder, his eyes wide with desperate tears. The man spoke in a strange, guttural dialect of Middle English, but the raw terror in his voice required no translation. He was begging for help. He pointed toward a small, dark hovel nearby. Despite the overwhelming urge to flee and protect his own life, the Hippocratic oath he had taken years ago tugged at James's core. He followed the blacksmith into the dim, smoke-filled cottage. On a straw mattress lay a young girl, no older than 12. She was shivering violently, her skin flushed with a raging fever. James knelt beside her, his mind automatically racing through modern diagnostic protocols. He felt her neck. The lymph nodes were already swelling, hard and incredibly tender to the touch. She was in the early stages of the bubonic plague. The blacksmith watched him with a mixture of reverence and fear, whispering words that sounded like he believed James was a foreign physician or perhaps an angel sent by God. James looked around the room, feeling an unprecedented sense of utter helplessness. In the 21st century, a simple 10-day course of streptomycin or doxycycline would cure this infection completely. Here, he had nothing. No 4 lines, no sterile water, no fever reducers. He tried to communicate through basic gestures and simple words. He pointed to an iron pot and mimed drinking, repeating the word water and emphasizing that it must be boiled over the fire until it bubbled fiercely. The blacksmith looked confused but nodded frantically, eager to do anything to save his daughter. James knew that while boiling water wouldn't cure the bacteria already inside her, keeping her hydrated and preventing secondary waterborne infections was the only baseline support he could offer. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the cottage was kicked open. A man dressed in a long, flowing black robe stepped into the room. He wore a bizarre, bird-like mask made of dark leather, with glass eye openings and a long beak stuffed with aromatic herbs. In his hand, he carried a wooden cane. A medieval plague doctor. The man ignored James, walking straight to the bed and examining the girl with his cane, refusing to touch her directly with his hands. James watched in fascinated horror as the plague doctor pulled a small, rusted blade from his satchel. He intended to lance the buboes, a standard medieval practice believed to release the bad humors from the body. James knew this was a death sentence. Lancing an active, highly vascular bubo would not only cause excruciating pain but would likely induce immediate septic shock, pouring millions of deadly bacteria straight into the girl's bloodstream, while also aerosolizing the pathogen and infecting everyone else in the small room. "Stop!" James shouted, stepping between the doctor and the young girl. "No cutting. No blades." The plague doctor stiffened, his glass eyes glaring at James through the leather mask. He spoke in an angry, commanding tone, raising his wooden cane threateningly. The blacksmith cowered in the corner, torn between the authority of the local plague doctor and the strange, intensely confident foreigner in blue. James had to think fast. He could not explain microbiology, cellular biology, or sepsis to a man who believed disease was caused by a misalignment of Saturn and Jupiter or the wrath of an angry deity. He pointed to the rusted blade, then pointed to a piece of rotting meat on the floor, and shook his head violently. "Poison," James said loudly, trying to adapt his accent. "It brings the darkness faster. Clean water. Fire. Rest." The confrontation was cut short when the young girl suddenly sat up, coughing violently. A spray of fine, bloody mist erupted from her lips. James's medical training instantly triggered a code red panic in his mind. This was no longer just bubonic plague. The bacteria had migrated to her lungs. It had mutated into the airborne, highly contagious pneumonic plague. Every single drop of moisture she exhaled was now a lethal weapon. James grabbed the blacksmith and pulled him back, shouting for him to cover his mouth. He ripped a piece of linen from a clean sheet on a table, wrapping it tightly around his own face, though he knew simple cloth offered minimal protection against a weaponized medieval pathogen. The plague doctor, sensing the immediate shift in danger, backed out of the cottage without another word, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. The atmosphere in the cottage grew suffocatingly heavy. Over the next 48 hours, James remained by the girl's side, unable to abandon her. He used his modern knowledge of palliative care to keep her as comfortable as possible, using cool, boiled water to bathe her burning forehead and keeping her propped upright to assist her failing, fluid-filled lungs. He spent hours meticulously checking his own body for flea bites, knowing that a single microscopic puncture from a parasite living on the rats in the thatch roof could end his life within days. He watched the girl's father, the blacksmith, gradually succumb to the fever as well, having already inhaled the lethal pneumonic droplets during the initial coughing fit. The speed of the disease was terrifying. It was far faster and more aggressive than any modern outbreak James had ever studied. By the dawn of the third day, both the father and daughter had grown quiet, their breathing shallow and rattled. Before the noon sun reached its peak, they were both gone. James stood alone in the silent, dark cottage, staring at the lifeless bodies. The profound weight of his isolation crushed down on him. He was a master of modern medicine, a man who could interpret complex CT scans, perform emergency intubations, and administer targeted pharmacology. Yet here, he was as powerless as the peasants dying in the streets. His advanced knowledge was nothing more than a ghost, a useless script from a future that did not yet exist. He knew he had to leave the cottage before the town authorities arrived to seal the doors from the outside, a common practice to isolate infected homes. As he stepped out into the blinding sunlight, he found the street completely transformed. The panic had evolved into absolute madness. A procession of flatulents marched down the center of the road, stripping off their shirts and whipping their own backs with heavy leather cords tipped with iron spikes, their blood splattering onto the dirt walls of the houses. They chanted hymns, begging God for mercy, convinced that human sin had brought this apocalypse upon the earth. A group of locals, driven mad by fear and searching for a scapegoat, spotted James emerging from a house known to be infected. They noticed his strange clothes, his clean-shaven face, and the fact that he was still standing while everyone around him died. Voices began to rise in an angry, dangerous crescendo. They shouted words like sorcerer, witch, and poisoner. James realized with terrifying clarity that the plague was not the only killer in 1348. The breakdown of human society, the absolute collapse of reason, and the raw, animalistic fear of the populace were just as lethal. The crowd began to advance on him, holding wooden clubs and pitchforks. Turning on his heel, James ran. He darted through the winding, labyrinthine alleys of the medieval city, his running shoes giving him a slight advantage over the clumsy, leather-soled shoes of his pursuers. He sprinted past piles of unburied dead, past abandoned market stalls, and through clouds of foul-smelling smoke, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't stop running until he broke through the city's crumbling stone gates, stumbling into the open, overgrown fields of the surrounding countryside. He collapsed into the tall grass, gasping for air, his throat burning. Looking back, he saw the skyline of the medieval city, marked by the rising black plumes of funeral pyres and the distant, agonizing tolling of church bells. He was alive, but he was completely trapped in a world of darkness, an era where the invisible killer held absolute dominion over mankind. Sitting under an ancient oak tree, wrapped in his modern medical scrubs, the doctor realized that his greatest struggle for survival had only just begun. He would have to use every ounce of his understanding of hygiene, contamination, and biology just to keep himself alive day by day, walking as a lonely ghost through the greatest graveyard human history had ever known.